Stock market just opened. Dow bouncing back. It's up 100 points to start trading this morning, and this comes after yesterday's 530-point drop for the Dow. That was the worst day for the markets since March of last year. So we've been on this, sugar rush for the markets. Aaron Hedlund, chief economist with the Show Me Institute, is joining us on KCMO. Aaron, we saw the Dow down as much as 700 points yesterday. What do you make of that, and what caused it?
Hey, Pete. Yeah, great to join you. This is all really driven by the market's expectations for Fed rate cuts. They've been hoping and thinking that the Fed would be cutting rates at some point this year, sooner rather than later in their minds. And what we saw was inflation data came out higher than they were thinking, which kind of tampered hopes for imminent rate cuts.
So they were hoping that inflation would not come in as hot as it did yesterday, and therefore they could guarantee more or less a rate cut at some point this spring. And now, with that number coming in yesterday at 3.1%, you're saying the markets may have realized that rate cut may not be coming as soon as they hoped.
Exactly. There's a major mismatch between the market's expectations of rate cuts and the actual data that would justify it. Because if you look at the data, you mentioned 3.1% inflation. If you look at kind of a component of inflation called core, which strips out some of the wiggly elements of it, that was at 3.9% over the year, which is still considerably higher than the 2% the Fed is aiming for. So the inflation data doesn't really justify rate cuts. None of the other macroeconomic data suggests that we should be doing rate cuts. And I think the market was just a little bit depressed yesterday, realizing that rate cuts might be a little while off.
So earlier this morning, we got on Liz Klayman, Fox Business Network, and I asked her about the 2% goal. And she's like, well, that's an antiquated goal that we shouldn't really be targeting anymore. It's not the way of the world. We've got to change our perception of inflation, and maybe 3% is the new normal. She didn't necessarily like her own answer, but is she on to something there? Is that something we have to basically factor in?
Well, I'd say there's two issues at play. First of all, we had 2% inflation for multiple decades up until 2021. The idea that we are now permanently in a new regime where inflation has to be higher really doesn't make any sense to me. And really the reason we have higher inflation is because of bad policy over the past couple of years. Mm-hmm. But the other thing to say is, whatever you think of the 2%, the very critical thing for the Fed to do is they have to do what they say. So as long as the Fed said that their target is 2%, they have to first achieve that. Once they achieve it, if they then want to change the goal going forward, they can, but you can't change your mind before you've even succeeded at doing what you said.
That's a good point. All right, I want to play this clip from Jerome Powell last week on 60 Minutes and just get your response to it, talking about 2% inflation and that being a goal.
Are you committed to getting all the way to 2.0 before you cut the rates?
No, that's not what we say at all. No. We're committed to returning inflation to 2% over time. I've said that we wouldn't wait to get to 2% to cut rates.
All right, Aaron Hedlund, what do you say to Jerome Powell?
Yeah, so in terms of interpreting that, he sort of signaled that back in December when he said that they'd be looking at rate cuts as soon as they were confident inflation would get to 2.0%. So what that suggests is, even if we haven't actually gotten there yet, as long as they know it's going to be there, then they're going to potentially be open to rate cuts. I think there's a little bit of a mistake personally because it requires us to all trust in their crystal ball skills, and we know that those haven't always been so good.
Mm-hmm. All right, Aaron Hedlund with the Show Me Institute on KCMO. Now, when you look at the market reaction, we talked about yesterday's decline. This market's been propped up by what is called the Magnificent Seven stocks, and it really hasn't, as you have noted throughout this conversation, coordinated with what Main Street is dealing with right now. Do you see that changing at all in 2024, or do you think it's going to be more of the same, where the stock market and Main Street, Wall Street and Main Street, kind of have different years?
Yeah, well, first of all, that's a critical point, because when I look at economic health, I don't primarily look to the stock market. It's one of those things that gets a lot of attention, but when it comes to the day-to-day well-being of workers and families, the stock market's not top of the list. I look at more things like purchasing power and wages and things like that. I do expect 2024 is going to be a weakening economy compared to 2023, because when I look at the fundamentals like consumer spending, consumers' debt is at an all-time record, and delinquencies, basically people who are not actually able to pay off their debts, that is rising at the fastest pace since 2011. So to me, those are warning signs.
Yeah, big time warning signs. I mean, that's one of those things that you got to look at and you got to say to yourself, okay, when you're looking at delinquencies going up, when you're looking at record levels of credit card debt, that's why, and I know I believe you felt this way during the Trump administration, any president bragging about the stock market, now during the Trump years, the economic health overall was much better. But still, I always hate when presidents brag about the stock market because it never tells the full story.
Absolutely. It's one of those stats that I rarely cite. I mean, when I look to the Trump years and I look at the data, what I say is really good is the fact that the typical household income after adjusting for inflation rose by nearly $6,000 over just a few years. So that's very robust. Whereas if you look at the past few years, household income is down multiple thousands of dollars once you adjust for inflation.
Yeah. Oh, man. All right, Aaron, what are you watching for here over the next few months?
Well, I'm going to see, does the consumer spending data, when that comes in, does that hold up or does that start to weaken in the face of all this debt? And if that happens, then I would see some labor market softening potentially towards the summer.
Okay. All right, Aaron, thank you so much. Appreciate your time. Have a great day.
You too.
All right. Aaron Hedlund, chief economist with the Show Me Institute on KCMO Talk Radio.